Building Decision Tools Responsibly panel, and I'd like my panelists to introduce themselves, please.
Thanks. Good morning. My name's Clint Korver. I'm a venture capitalist with Ulu Ventures. Before this, I was an entrepreneur. I did a number of startup companies, and then before that, I was a Ron Howard PhD student.
Mike?
I'm Mike Norton. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School, and I talked about random robots yesterday.
My name is Dan Connors, and for 20 years I was a professor at University of Colorado in computer science, but in the last years I've been taking an extended leave to found Boulder AI, an artificial intelligence company.
All right, so I would like to dive right in and have us start out talking about a topic that Dan mentioned in discussions yesterday, which is the example of facial recognition systems and how they play into this topic as far as you're concerned.
So we talked about a lot of kind of the duality of both being able to do facial recognition with using pretty much open source tools these days, as well as deep fakes, the ability to synthesize new images from either existing sources or just a synthetic image generation. And that is at least the scariest area of what I think in the domain of needing some form of regulation of tools and to have more oversight in the process of generation, just because it's become so easily available, I mean, for teaching students especially.
So what specifically is scary about it to you?
So the concept of not knowing how much your data, the concept of yourself, might actually being used in an existing system. So the fact that you might have your own face being used in a training set, that's one thing. But if actually these AI tools have already been targeted for recognition of yourself. So who knows whether or not the department stores downstairs are already trying to spot Dan Connors walk by to know that my location can now be kind of served out to other corporations. So to me, it's just the difference between what we view as science fiction and what we think is a few years off, and we have time to talk. We have 10 years, and we don't have that amount of time.
So the theme here is some things are creepy, and we may talk about how whether or not creepiness justifies intervention, regulation, etc. And on the other side, there's something around expectations of folks who are non-experts in these systems, and these expectations may be a little bit narrow about what the systems can do, and then there's a surprise down the line when all of a sudden the capabilities of these systems, everyone thinks are science fiction, but it's actually here today. So which of these two sides is the scarier one to you?
To me, the scarier side is the general, the population's knowledge that these things would not be intrusive and that they are not yet available. So I guess it's understanding what the public sentiment is on their availability and their use. And it's also the difference between thinking, it's different between having a government at the high level have billion-dollar data centers that they can manage systems versus at the low level an individual that might deploy the technology.
And Mike and Clint, what are your thoughts about who is responsible for bringing the public up to speed? Is anyone responsible for that? Is it the public's own fault that they don't know what these things are capable of? And then,
can I share one other quick
please.
example of facial recognition, because I think the way the public interprets it. So one of my favorites, so I was at the MIT Media Lab now a long time ago when facial recognition was new. That's how long ago it was. And these students who were awesome made a very simple facial recognition program that basically, in a public place on campus, would take the emotions off of students' faces and show a summary, like how happy or sad was the campus that day. which was super cute, actually, right? So like on exams, it was like a huge frowny face, and then whatever, spring break, it was like a big smiley face. So it was like purely fun. Except that when you think, so you can think that's fun and interesting, and also it doesn't really violate anyone's privacy, right? Because it's an aggregate. Someone could say MIT is feeling that way, but not that person is feeling that way. So it also felt okay it didn't trigger for anyone, including me, the sort of privacy concern. If you think about what that technology can be used for, like one of the applications was a large corporation decided to use it in meeting rooms when they had work teams. And then they can figure out how well the teams are getting along without necessarily the teams even knowing. Now, they still weren't saying, like, you, me, you. They were saying the four of us, but now it's four instead of a campus, and then it starts to get creepier. So I think sometimes I think people think the aggregation of the data kind of makes it more okay that I can't pick you out. But even if I can't pick you out, it's still actually really problematic for lots of reasons.
Well, I would also say this is like part of a class of technologies where I think a lot of consumers don't fully appreciate how much data people really have of you. So for example, if you've got one of these things and you're connected up to Wi-Fi, this all gets tracked.
Is that a pager?
Yeah, exactly. So by the way, they don't know that Clint Korver is in this room, but there are folks that know that this phone with this unique ID is in this room. And there's all kinds of other ways that folks are tracking you. Now, it's not clear that people have kind of smart and useful things to do with this, but that's just around the corner. So I think this facial recognition privacy issue, multiply that by 10, and that's kind of what we're facing.
So I do want to push though on whose responsibility is it to solve things that are problematic because the recipients or users are insufficiently informed about the capabilities of what they've signed up for. So not everyone presumably knows that their phone gives that kind of information.
By the way, you can turn your Wi-Fi off and then you're not tracked. Well, so just on the responsibility, so I actually think this is a really hairy kind of question, and I think there's different levels to it. So one level I would say is, well, who gets to say that something inappropriate is going on? So at one level you could say, well, the user might say, imagine you had full disclosure to the user. It's like, here's all the data I'm collecting from you, here's all the inferences I'm making about you, and here's how I'm serving up personalization or recommendations or whatever it happens to be. And so you imagine if you had full disclosure to the user, would the user say, oh, wait a second, that feels really creepy to me. So that would be one standard. And I think that's actually a standard that technologically you can do things with. There's another standard which says, suppose the user is perfectly fine. It's like, oh yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm getting a better user experience because of all this data. I'm totally fine with that. But now there's somebody else that says, no, that's inappropriate, right? So like a government regulation or society, right, says, that's perpetuating something in society that, we feel is inappropriate. So that to me is a much harder, essentially, constituency to go address.
Can I describe a scenario? This is what made me start to leave academia about 5 years ago, is because I was able to, with my class of students, invent something that we called the face cloud. And this was using Raspberry Pis, which at the time were only $35, being able to run OpenCV, an open source computer vision program. And the whole goal was that they had to collectively build these nodes, deploy them in the public, and anytime a face walked by, we'd crop the face and send it up to Google Cloud, and then do a face correlation back kind of on a server side. And the notion wasn't that people would be aware of their faces being detected. And what we came up with was the concept that is, you could have a free search query that says, hey, was this face down on 16th Street in Denver? And you would get back results. And searches were free, and the way to opt out was if you didn't want your face in, you send us $25 a month and we don't allow your face to be searched. And so the question there is it's fine when celebrities get tracked with TMZ and all these National Enquirer magazines, and they're like, oh, that's Brad Pitt's, he's a public profile. He knows that he should be tracked. But when it's you, it's a whole different scenario when you're...
Did you leave academia so you could charge $50 instead of $25? Did I miss the moral of the story there, I think?
The moral of this story was, at the time, the Raspberry Pi wasn't enough computing power, so we had to put an NVIDIA TX2 engine together, and that's what Boulder AI does.
So the audience is asking, isn't the right to privacy the biggest issue? Mike, maybe you want to weigh in?
So literally this morning, there's a piece in the New York Times, and a law professor, I think, and she was writing about, so she gives her students this assignment, which is go to a public place and listen to people's conversations and see if you can figure out their identity. Not looking at anything they're doing, just listening to their words, and a shocking amount of the time they can. So there's this view, so I'm thinking of the offline world for a second, which is like the world, actually, the old world or whatever, where there were like humans. And we disclose things all the time in public. So if you think of the phone calls that you have, like when you're in an Uber, and you're like negotiating your divorce settlement, whatever you're doing, that person knows all this stuff about you. And we feel, so the point of this article, which was so interesting, is we feel when we're in a crowd that we're anonymous, except any one person can decide that we're the target of listening in a crowd. There was a story of some guy who was like on the phone with his accountant, and he was like shouting his social security number over and over again. And finally the person like wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it to him. Like, do you know what you're doing right now? So I think there is in some sense that we're really insensitive to our privacy, period. I think my colleague Leslie John at HBS studies privacy concerns. I mean, there's really strange disconnect between like the deep desire for privacy, like deeply, profoundly, like in the constitution of many countries, and also we disclose the most personal things all the time without even thinking about it. And so one of the things that Leslie looks at is how do we make it incumbent upon consumers to think more carefully about what they're disclosing. So I think absolutely we should talk about regulation and things like that, but there's another sense in which, I'm a social scientist, social psychologist, so I think about changing people's behavior at the micro level. How do I get you to think more about what it is that you're doing? Also, the regulatory stuff is important as well, but I think there's a lot of research now happening on how do we help people understand what they're doing with their own privacy in order to help them protect themselves more.
Any thoughts, Clint, on that privacy topic?
Well, so I very much echo this notion of helping individuals make better decisions on their own, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road on this, because you may have some users that are just fine disclosing a lot of information because they want the better experience. And from my point of view, good tools will be sensitive to that. And then there's other folks that say, I'm okay with, call it the generic experience, because I'm very concerned about my privacy. So to the extent AI tools can suss out that difference in their users, I think that's a big step in the right direction.
And I do want to bring up this topic of regulation. Folks, which part of the AI system or process or life cycle should be regulated, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, so there's a certain class of regulation that I'm a big fan of. So think like underwriter's laboratory. So you've got essentially a set of feedback systems in the market that basically help people be dynamic. So if you want, call it the Google seal of approval, that your AI system is being very thoughtful about the requisite amount of data, and you've appropriately tested it and that sort of thing, that could be very valuable in the marketplace. So if I'm building an AI tool set and Google has given me the seal of approval, now I'm going to be, hopefully my customers will view that as useful and valuable. And oh, by the way, if somebody who is quite unsophisticated about how they build AI tools, and now they use your tool set, and they're out there, and it's like, oh, you don't get our Google seal of approval because, it's like, there's some things here we're concerned about. So now all of a sudden you've got what I would call a market mechanism to say, well, where is it important for these kinds of, essentially, approvals to be there? So the thing I worry about with A regulatory agency it's a blunt instrument. So all of a sudden, it's like everything in this class has to go through this sort of approvals. And we're so early in the design of these things that it feels like a blunt instrument is going to create as much unintended consequences that are bad as good.
So to make a rough caricature of 3 places where you might think about regulating, 4 really, but where the 4th would be to do with public's perception, but 3 to do specifically with the system. So you're talking about the one where we begin thinking about it after the whole system is built and we're looking at performance of the whole system. Another might be looking at the model itself and regulating that, and that may be the poorest choice. And then there's the other of regulating the initial design document, the goal of the system, how you're going to test it, and on what data it is allowed to be based. So what are your feelings about these 3 areas for potential regulation?
Well, so let's kind of like take these in order. So if you think about like, the tool set builders, think of the Googles of the world, right? You're building a tool set for AI developers who are then building tools, AI systems for users. So if I think about like at the tool set level, well, it's kind of like, you probably have data checkers in here, right? So if somebody's doing something wrong or like the data set's not big enough, you've got a way to, it's like, you've got a little warning sign that comes up saying, oh, your data set's not big enough, these conclusions may not be valid. Is that those kind of tools? Is that a fair assessment?
To the extent that we have made public statements about such things.
Oh, okay. Well then. So if you got like
let me say that principles of wise designs of systems would require such checks.
Okay. So if you've got a set of data checkers in there, so I'd love to see a set of, call it decision checkers. So basically, as being a decision analyst, and I think about what's first principles. Well, who's the decision maker? What decision are they making? What do they want to achieve? So that's a line of inquiry that it would be great at the tool set level to encourage the AI builders to have. So you say, okay, well, let's push the button, I'm going to check the data. Oh, let's push the button, I'm going to check the decision part of this. And the nice thing about like a AI tool set is there's really, I think, clever ways you can go test the decision side of this. So maybe you go crowdsource values, for example. So, well, I'm estimating, this set of preferences for you. Well, maybe I can go check that with a representative sample of people that look like that. And so as opposed to sort of like, so I would favor those kinds of feedback systems as opposed to a regulatory feedback system where somebody goes, oh, you might do something dangerous that your ultimate end user would find offensive. If you can build a double check in the middle someplace.
So you would require for businesses that are using machine learning and AI algorithms to have those checks as part of their process, but you might not specifically regulate the particulars of those checks. Is that what you are?
Well, so I guess I would think about, again, if I'm putting my Google hat on for a moment, it's like, how do I design tool systems that help my users do smart things, right? So if part of the smart AI design, okay, here are these 3 steps in the design process. By the way, I like your notion of start with the outputs, then build the model, and then go to the inputs. Well, if imagine there's a 4th step in there and validate with your decision owners. Because in some ways, the tool set is making the decision, but they're making the decision on behalf of somebody. And so if you could go to that somebody and validate that, and oh, by the way, that's just a standard smart thing to do when you're building an AI system, and oh, by the way, all you have to do as a designer is push the button and it happens. Now you don't need regulation. Now it's just people are doing it because you've built it as a standard step in the workflow.
Mike, Dan, do you have anything close to your heart there, or should I push us to a new direction?
Well, I think that we'll see as more and more AI systems come about in everywhere from driverless vehicles to healthcare, that there will definitely be domains that get regulated first. Healthcare being one, of course, transportation. Some of the domains, I think, are already too late to be sufficiently or effectively regulated because the tool technologies are so verbose, so available. And so I work more in the computer vision area where we talk about taking images or video and extracting in representations from them. And the thought process of how right now you would put some barriers to the generation of tools when it's not coming from distinct communities like corporation Google or Amazon. It's sometimes coming from universities, but there is the capabilities of individuals to change radically what we were just doing 6 months ago based on what was happening 6 months ago. So it's all, we're kind of in that hockey stick curve already, and we don't know for image processing domain how it could get pulled back.
Can I cold call Clint? So Clint had an idea yesterday that I thought was super interesting to think about, which is that, so the question is who's culpable if it's used for ill? And I think your suggestion was, or an idea that I thought was cool was that if you build a tool that someone else uses for ill, are you culpable or not? And I wonder if you can, now I'm just mansplaining for Clint-splaining, I guess is what I'm doing right now, but if you want to just flesh that out a little bit. I thought it was an interesting idea.
Yeah, well, so I think, so if you think about like the analog for a moment, so imagine that the tool set's not making the decision, but an individual's making the decision. And so, we're decision consultants, right? We go help people make decisions. Okay, now imagine that's a context where some bad decision gets made, right? So something where somebody else looks at it and said, oh, there is some ethical problem with what happened there. Okay, well, whose fault is it? Well, you've got sort of the person that actually made the decision. So, there's certainly some potential responsibility there. But they might say, but wait a second, I had this decision consultant that came in and they presented this set of information and values and so forth. And, if I'm going down an unethical road, I would have expected them to tell me or give me better information. So certainly there's some potential responsibility that's basically can be from a culpability point of view would be for call it the tool set designer, because they're essentially acting as the decision consultant here. They're making the choices about how we pull this information together and how we come up with ultimate conclusions and so forth. But then you can say, there's also, go one step further, so the decision consultant might say, well, wait a second, I was using this, spreadsheet thing, and, the spreadsheet thing basically made an error here, and because of that error, I completely missed the safety consequences of whatever we're talking about here. So now you can go back to, okay, well, who built the spreadsheet? And it's like, okay, if you knew that your spreadsheet was going to be using for like life and death decisions, and there's an error in there, how close is too close, I guess is the question. And by the way, let me get a concrete example. So we're talking, the driverless cars is a little bit hairy. So let's take one a little less hairy but still consequential. So think of digital advisors. So this is like a big trend right now where, give us your money and we will algorithmically invest it all. So now imagine there's a problem in the algorithm and like, oops, sorry, we've just lost your life savings. It's like, okay, well, whose problem is that? Well, at one level, you could imagine if you did full transparency so we got these three players. We got the people that build the AI development tools like Google. We got the people that actually built the AI system. So this would be the Betterment, the Wealthfront, the LFS, the people that are doing the digital, providing the service, and then you've got the consumer. So the gold standard in my mind would be total transparency, where you as a consumer fully understand the risks, people were able to fully describe what those risks were to you, and I would say at that point, it's 100% the responsibility of the consumer in terms of culpability. You freely chose up to the system knowing the risks, you lost all your money, you realized that, our algorithms are only 99.9% reliable, so buyer beware. But if there wasn't full disclosure, and by the way, imagine the AI system is such that you can't do full disclosure because you don't know what's going on the inside. All you know is, hey, we tested you out against, these million examples across these sorts of scenarios, but if, all of a sudden we have a trade war with China, I don't know, we don't have any of that data in our system. And by the way, if you don't disclose that, now all of a sudden it's like whoever built that tool system, I'd say they're starting to share in some of that culpability.
The other thing that we just briefly talked about yesterday, and I also promised I would use this analogy again today, is so when you're a homeowner and you do something wrong with the gas, it smells like rotten eggs. because someone knew that homeowners were stupid and they would do wrong things with their gas lines, and gas has no smell, so they said, let's make it stinky. And it does two things. One is you realize you've done something wrong. There's an immediate cost to you in a sense because it means your house might blow up, and you might also blow up your neighborhood. So there's just because of this little smell, there's this amazing safeguard on all of these problems that could happen. And if you think about actually I'm not sure which constituency of the ones you designed, but imagine all of those constituencies. What is the way to insert the rotten egg smell? Like you can still, when your house smells like rotten eggs, you can totally still light a match if you want. You know what I mean? Like nobody can stop you. That's your choice, but you knew at least that something was wrong before you did it. So trying to think about ways that short of regulation, but building things in where there's some signal to designers that maybe there's something a little bit questionable about this or that. I don't think we're there yet at all with the technology, but just conceptually. I think.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're going in this direction. Actually, when I picked the title for the panel, the tools part was something, it meant something obvious to me, but we realized that it wasn't necessarily something that this audience would assume. So this audience might think of the AI system and its data and its tools and all its development as one big lump, and then the society and consumers and users as the second lump. Whereas in my mind, there is businesses who are using algorithms that they usually don't build in-house to get things done. And then there are the builders of those tools or algorithms in the first place that businesses will pick up without understanding how those things work. And so I wanted us in this panel, as we did, to talk not only about the choice to serve something to users or consumers and to use data that the typical business does, but also the researchers and companies who are making the tool in the first place. How did they inject that rotten egg smell so that if some business is foolish about how that tool is used, so that there's some layer of protection, that there's at least some property of these tools that make it a little bit safer. And you all had some great ideas, so I'll just open the floor to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, so I love the rotten egg metaphor. So you think, okay, so I'm a tool designer. I'm an AI. So I've got your tool set. I'm an AI tool designer doing dumb things. Right now, I put my dumb things are out there in the world, and there's all these embedded biases and so forth that are going to create problems. So now the question is, how can the tool set help me get the feedback? I've just done something dumb. And I could imagine, maybe you've got a set of, guess what, here are the 10 dumb things people like Clint are likely to do who aren't trained in AI but are trying to do an AI system. And oh, by the way, one of those things is make incorrect assumptions about people, right, on not enough data and so forth. So now is there a way for my users to tell me that? Right, so imagine that you're a user and something kind of offensive happens. It's not at the level of harm yet, but it's like, oh, this is like rubbing me the wrong way. So maybe embedded in the system there's a this doesn't seem right button, or this really offends me button. Mm-hmm. And if I've designed, if the tool set has been built in such a way that, okay, I've served something up based on a set of incorrect, algorithmic assumptions, and somebody says this is wrong, now it's coming feeding back to me. So if I'm a designer and all of a sudden I get 100 emails in my box saying I've got 100 offended people, that's kind of like,
mm-hmm.
the rotten egg smell.
Right.
By the way, if you're smelling rotten egg smell right now, it's not because there's a gas leak, but the human mind is so weird that you can actually smell things that aren't there because someone mentioned it. So don't be alarmed if you are smelling the rotten egg smell. It's not, to my knowledge, happening in the room.
So this is Michael doing a little CYA because he was like, how can we get that smell in here when we're talking about it? I'm going to get that.
Sorry.
So a specific change that you can make to a tool, we think about this at Google, is to include some outlier detection capabilities so that if you are attempting to run the system on a data point that's very, very different from the centroids of the data that this was trained on, and reads like an outlier, then maybe some kind of flag is thrown. And if you throw enough flags during operation, it's saying, hey, whoa, you keep using this system really outside of the parameters that it is designed to operate in. Other ideas, you had ideas not only around the surfacing analytics parts, but also around being able to interact and modify that system based on feedback. What were some of those ideas?
Well, so just to kind of, I think, if you think about analogs in the world out there, so how have people solved this problem before? So like, doctors, right? I mean, all of a sudden doctors get access to all kinds of dangerous medicines and whatnot, and how do we as a society or you as an individual consumer trust that doctor? Well, they've got a certification, right? So they've gone through all this training and somebody says, this is a trustworthy person. So this isn't quite tool set yet, but there's certainly the certification part of it. There is the warranty part of it. So basically you say, hey, look, if we create problems, so if I'm going to build a financial system, and oh, by the way, that financial system loses all your money because of an algorithmic problem, we're going to pay you back. So we're going to get insurance on this thing, and the reason you're going to trust our system as opposed to somebody else's system is because we're putting our money where our mouth is. And so these aren't quite technical solutions yet, but I would say they're strong incentives for people to build tools that makes. By the way, I think I'm actually I don't know about uniquely, but I'm actually quite qualified to talk about building bad systems. As full disclosure, I attempted to build a decision system, actually kind of an analytic-driven decision system, ended up losing a whole bunch of VC money in the process doing it. So I think I feel qualified to talk about this part of it.
Yeah, and I also want to share with you just some more context around how this is now a summary of our much richer discussion on this topic yesterday. So what Clint has said is a summary, but kind of the way that we came to it was Dan was talking about how the users of these algorithms, the users of the tools, the businesses, may be not qualified. So maybe a very qualified data scientist, maybe someone who's just plugging data into something willy-nilly. And the discussion then between Dan and Clint was the suggestion that, all right, maybe we should think about what do we do with systems that might be in the hands of expert users or these foolish users, and expert users maybe don't need the same kind of guardrails as the non-experts. So those were some great ideas, but then we get into an area where maybe Mike and Clint can fight, because we started talking about, well, how much should you treat users of these things, both the first stage and then the second stage users, as children versus adults? And Mike is a lot about influencing user behavior. And Clint, I felt that you were very hands-off the influencing of their behavior and treat them as adults.
Yeah, so I'm very much a fan of treating people like adults. Yes, so.
What are your
Mike,
thoughts,
you want
Mike?
to take the kid point of view for a moment?
I don't recall saying let's treat people like children, but I follow.
That's my framing. I'm
Yeah.
helping clarify the issue for the audience.
Yeah. I think if you look at lots of regulation across whatever industry you want, some sort of premise in it is that some people left to their own devices, some of the time will do wrong things. Not because they're bad people, they're just wrong things. So it's illegal to drink and drive. And I think those sorts of laws are not necessarily treating people like they can't make their own decisions, but there's a public good that they're not just harming themselves. There's a public good that they're harming, and any random person is as likely to do it as any other. So you're not sort of singling out those people for the law. It's kind of a broad law to preserve the public good. So a lot of the interventions that I think about with people are understanding that people are human and that they will sometimes unwittingly not just harm themselves, so there's, I don't get into like libertarianism or whatever, but that they'll harm the public good without being aware of it. And so safeguards that help people when they are doing that, at minimum, that it does not affect the public good, it only affects them, is one way to think about it. And the other, which is a little bit like rotten egg smell, like only your house will blow up, when it becomes a thing where the entire neighborhood will blow up. My colleague, Leslie John, who I mentioned earlier, who studies privacy, she has lots of amazing papers. One of them is this. So she asks people a whole bunch of really sensitive personal questions, and you don't get paid at all. And she just sees how many of them people will answer. Like literally things like, have you ever lied to someone about an STD? And most people are like, I don't really want to answer that very much, but she does things like this, okay? So she puts it on a website that has ridiculous graphics, and it's called How Bad Are You? And on that website, people will totally answer all the questions because it's fun. And then you get feedback on what other people answered. And no one is like, wait a minute, I don't think I should be answering these questions because it's fun. Then she has another website that looks super official and it has all like the seals at the bottom, you know, like certified by something. And on that, people will disclose nothing because it reminds them that they're not supposed to disclose this stuff. Okay, so you can say that that's people being ridiculous, or just that we're different people at different times, I think is what I would say. And so trying to help people make better decisions along that is something that, all right, I'm gonna say one more thing. Companies make us do stuff all the time. So like the baseline is not we are ourselves and then these interventions make us someone else. The world is already a baseline of pushing us to do all sorts of stuff. Like that's why most of us are wearing pants, because the world told us that we should probably wear pants. Not like our natural state to wear pants, but the world has told us that. So when you design things to move people in one direction or another, you're not typically taking them away from their like natural state. You're taking them away from whatever state the world has put them in. So I think there's a subtlety to it, which is it's not necessarily paternalistic. It's kind of like everyone's pushing us around, and we can try to design things so that we're making decisions a little more consistent with what we'd like to be. That was a very long answer.
And do you have any concrete things that we could do better?
For like consumers or designers or?
Whichever you prefer.
Yeah.
And Dan, you've also been quiet for a while, so I just want to make sure you get your...
Well, I was going to say for the designer realm, where I think there's tremendous need is coming from my view of student education or just developer education, is that a lot of times we even have this ambiguous term known as data science, that if you go and use Google Ngrams to search, this didn't exist 5 years ago, as far as about 6 years ago, as far as a term, and now there's whole master's degree programs in data science. So what are you specializing in data science? Data. What data? I don't care. It's going to be from one job opportunity to the next sometimes, and there's shorter paths to getting from a traditional liberal arts education now into data science. And you might get hired into a healthcare industry and not know anything about, and be building a predictor for diabetes and not know anything about vitals and labs results and how they're collected. And yet part of what your that job role will do is build a tool that then gets either utilized by a clinician or utilized by an individual to predict whether or not they're going to develop diabetes in the next 6 months. So there's this awareness that needs to go into, and somewhere along the line needs to be embraced, that says if you're going to work in the field of healthcare, there has to be some certification that goes with applying data science in that realm. Otherwise, right now, it's there's kind of this missing gap that you might have background in doing data science and background in research, and even maybe some electronic health record, but not anything to do with the clinical practice of medicine, which is what the algorithms are intended to do. So I think in each of these areas, it's going to be needed for the data scientists to have some type of more specialized certification.
Can I jump in?
Please.
So I'd actually argue that we've got pretty good systems for that right now. So like if I go to my doctor and I say, hey, do I have a problem? I'm trusting my doctor to be thoughtful about the tools they use and how they go about their. I mean, because and by the way, there's some liability there, right? So if the doctor basically says, "Oh, Clint, you're fine," and 6 months later it's like, "Oh, guess what? I have diabetes, but now I caught it 6 months too late. Now I've got all kinds of problems." I'm pretty unhappy with my doctor. By the way, I don't know if you know Theranos, but that was one of their potential issues. But I guess what I'd say is, so in my mind, I'm relying on the doctor to be a smart consumer of whatever tools and analysis they're using. And so I think, and I would hope that the doctors, when they're thinking, okay, do I use, this data science-driven, algorithm to analyze the radiology reports or whatnot versus this one over there, they're being like very thoughtful, like, oh, well, who built it? And what kind of tools? And how did you train it? And do you know anything about healthcare? Because, by the way, if you don't, no way in hell am I going to buy that and use it on my customers. So I think in the abstract, I think this is kind of hard to pin down. But if you actually have a specific use case like that, or digital wealth advisors, or automate. I mean, so that's why I think that the devil's in the detail on this one. I mean, it's such a broad tool set. And Cassie, I liked your notion that this is like a lever. Right, this just amplifies things, but it's one of these monster levers, and it can apply so many different places. It's really hard to come up with sort of general purpose thought, and maybe we can eventually, right? So after there's been a few thousand applications, and everybody in the U.S. has been through this a dozen times with a dozen different. It's like, oh, now we get it. Now we know what the patterns are and so forth. So and by the way, in case it's not obvious, so I'm a card-carrying libertarian, so when you push me on the regulation stuff, that might be why I'm a bit evasive.
So I also want to bring up now, in our last 2 minutes, a topic that we as decision analysts are very good at thinking about, but maybe the general public is not so good at this. This is this natural idea. No one here will be surprised by this idea that machine learning systems make mistakes. They are not perfect. They are not deterministic. They are based on incomplete data. And
Is that the official position of Google, or are you just saying
that they make mistakes? I think that if anyone at Google has ever told anyone that these systems are perfect, I would love to loudly undo that, because these systems are not. They're making the best out of patterns in data, and they are automating things that cannot just be handcrafted deterministically. So mistakes are there. And this community is pretty good at thinking through those mistakes. But maybe there's a lot of shock in the public that mistakes are possible at all. And then you have situations also where you have a lot of good and a lot of correct acts, and then a mistake causes surprises, outrage, both in the public and maybe among non-DA folk who have built systems to serve their customers. So things are going correctly for 10,000 goes, and then the 10,001st is a mistake, and everyone is excessively surprised. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and I'd also love to get your thoughts on a phenomenon around a system that is very close to perfect might be more dangerous than a system that is obviously imperfect in terms of the safety nets and other things that will accompany such systems. So last thoughts on the topic of mistakes and protecting the public from them.
That's a tough one.
Dan, how are you doing over there with mistakes?
I mean, as you were talking, the only thing I came up with is the President Trump getting elected, and all the systems that went into predicting that couldn't happen, and everyone feeling safe, and then not. So I'm still reeling from that a little bit to say I thought things were going. I thought the systems and the data was tracking in a certain way, and I didn't need to believe my students that told me I didn't know what was going on. So.
Well, I mean, so certainly I'd say so fake news in my mind is a real head scratcher on this, right? In the sense of it's got all these tentacles out there, and it touches so many different people, and it's so let's put that one aside. But it's like the wealth management in my mind is a little bit easier in the sense that okay, people clearly care if you lose their money, and I think there is a So I guess what I'd say is like there's probably like a list of use cases and there's categories. So there's a category of things here where it's relatively straightforward to deal with because we can find a decision maker, we can find a set of preferences, and we can do all our standard decision analysis tools. That applies very well. And then like with the fake news, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, who's the decision maker? It's like, well, who was ever serving up the articles maybe? I'm not sure exactly who's ever deciding to read the articles, but it gets there's probably a whole other session just on that.
Well, let's finish up the panel with one idea or piece of advice that's close to your heart on the topic of responsibility and AI. Just do one from each member of the panel.
I just, on the topic of fake news, there's some really cool new research by a guy named Dave Rand at MIT. And he shows that, these systems where they now try to flag fake news, sometimes it's humans flagging it, sometimes it's an algorithm flagging it. What he shows is that when news is flagged as fake, you do discount it more. But what you also do is you then inflate the truth value of anything that's not tagged, whether or not that's fake news or not. Right? So when you insert these systems that seem to solve one problem, and by the way, the algorithms are really good at spotting fake news. So their misses are very high, but their hits are very accurate. So they miss a lot, but when they label something fake news, it usually is. But it's the misses that are the problem because now people are thinking all the misses are actually real news. So the unintended consequences sometimes of applying the good stuff, even when it's working well, to what happens on the output on the other end, I think is something that I've been thinking a lot more about.
My core goes to, again, computer vision and just the knowledge of that there's a difference between what humans should anticipate now as what is observable by another human. And we talked a little bit about this as saying, your behavior and your decision making, what it comes down to is when you feel you're being watched. And if you think, oh, well, if there's a person there, a security guard, some type of monitor, the person would only be able to extract this information from me. And if you look forward in terms of what the advancements of computer systems with higher resolution, fidelity, deeper channel depth in cameras, and neural networks being constantly applied to the data, there's so much more that a computer system can do that human eyes cannot. So if you are right now driving in the HOV lane saying, oh, CDOT can't tell that I don't have 3 people in the car, because they can't see into the glass, they want that. So they want that so that you don't have that transponder switch that just says, yeah, sure, I have 3 people in the car in the HOV lane coming from Boulder. So the technology is just incredibly advanced in terms of what's being developed, and that's going to affect decision makers like, should I ride in the HOV lane or not, just even at that level.
And I guess, so my hope/request would be for the people building the tools, alongside the data checker, which may or may not be there, I'd love to have a decision checker, which allows the people building the AI tools, well, first of all, to think about this notion that, oh, there's a decision maker in here and I need to think about their preferences and so forth, but also a way to essentially validate that as they're building tools and as they're running tools.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, and let's thank our panelists.